All right, good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, Outcomes-Based Assessment for Campuses. This is Carrie Solar at the Ohio Department of Higher Education. I'm joined today by Drs. Faith DiNardo from Bowling Green State University and Sandra Ortega from Sandra Ortega Consulting. They are the individuals who are going to lead you in this webinar today. Before we get started, I do ask that if you have a door that you can close on your office and or if you can mute your phone on your end, if possible, please do so. We are recording the webinar today, so any conversations you are having will be recorded for others to listen into, so that's probably not something you want. It's also important to eliminate as much background noise as possible, and that includes typing on your keyboard, so that those who couldn't join us today or any of you who would like a copy of this down the road have the ability to take in the full measure of the presentation today. As many of you know, ODHE is asking campuses to complete assessment on your programs or training as one of the criterion for achieving recommendation 2 on the annual report this year and moving forward. While we're not asking you to do an assessment on every program, we do feel it's important for you to make sure that you're able to gauge the effectiveness of your trainings and understand if the outcomes you set forth when designing the training have been achieved. These are not things that can be assessed through a campus climate survey, and I say that because a lot of the feedback I have received from campuses in terms of assessments that they're doing on their programming are largely based on their campus climate survey or benchmark results, and that's not going to give you kind of that granular data that you need to know if your programs that or trainings you're doing are hitting the mark. So that means that moving forward, your campus climate survey cannot be your method of assessment for recommendation number 2 in your annual report. And if you have questions about that after the webinar, I am more than happy to answer those for you on an individual basis. So knowing all of this, I wanted to be sure that we provided you with some creative and strategic ideas on how to capture assessment data for your programs, and that is what I hope we can accomplish here together today. So just very briefly, introduce you to our presenters today. Faith DiNardo is the Director of the Wellness Connection and Deputy Title IX Coordinator at Bowling Green State University. And Sandra Ortega is the owner of Sandra Ortega Consulting. Many of you know her as she was one of 2 on a team last time around that led us through the campus climate survey data. And I know Sandra's evaluation and assessment experience goes far beyond just those campus climate surveys, as she's done a ton of work for the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and other consortium groups across the state dealing with sexual and intimate partner violence, but has been really key in the Delta Focus efforts of the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and the CDC grant they've received. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our presenters today.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks, Carrie.
And thank you, everybody, for being here today. As you know, the Ohio Department of Higher Education recommendation number 2 requires you to complete an outcomes-based assessment on some of the programs, trainings you offer on campus for prevention and response. More specifically, the 2017 reporting requirement is each campus will report on 2 outcomes for either their response or prevention training. The fill-in items number 17 and number 18 on the Changing Campus Culture annual report. Today, Faith and I are going to offer some ideas on how to start planning for what you're going to report on in the upcoming reporting year.
So in honor of Halloween, there's our happy ghost there, and we want you to know that assessment is not so scary, and so that's hopefully what we accomplished today. So we're going to share some of the tools and techniques that we use to take the fright out of assessment, and in particular, outcome reporting. So Sandra's and my goal over the next 40 minutes is to break down the processes we have used to manage outcomes, reporting for prevention, and intervention work. So hang in there with us, and hopefully you'll feel that that's a friendly ghost versus a scary ghost there. So before we get too far into the presentation, we wanted to take a moment to talk about what is meant by an outcome, so we're all on the same page. When we talk about outcome, so what does that mean? Well, when we're talking about outcome, it's a result or effect of an action. So outcome equals change. So the change can occur in knowledge, in attitudes, intended behaviors, or skills. Essentially, it can also be self-efficacy. And just a reminder, self-efficacy is one's belief in their ability to succeed in specific situations or accomplish a task. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about was learning outcomes. And some of you may be very familiar with learning outcomes and some of you may not. But learning outcomes are statements that describe significant and essential learning that learners have achieved and can reliably demonstrate at the end of a course or a program. So in other words, learning outcomes identify what the learner will know and be able to do by the end of a course, program, or training. And one of the things that we've been working on here at BGSU is to align our student affairs learning outcomes with academic affairs learning outcomes. So at the end of the presentation, when we talk about collaborations, this could be an option on your campus or maybe something similar. And perhaps maybe some of you are already doing this and it's already happening on your campus, but we'll talk more about that towards the end of the presentation. So one of the things that we wanted to mention was the idea between learning objectives versus learning outcomes. So we start with learning objectives. So we want to ask the questions with learning objectives. What do you want to happen as a result of your prevention or response activity? What do you want people to learn? How much change do you want to see from where they are at the beginning of their participation and then by the end of the participation, in the event, in the program, in the training, whatever you're looking to assess? So we want to think about knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, skills, things we want to change for our participants. And so this slide is an example from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute about how they define objectives, and I thought this was a good way of thinking about objectives, meaning that, they can describe goals and intentions of the program, class, etc. They often term the input into the course, state the purpose and goals of the course, or event or program or whatever you're looking to assess. And again, focus on content and skills that could be important within that program, within that event, etc. They can often be numerous, so there could be a lot of objectives. They can be specific, detailed, and assess and report on each objectives for each student. That can be kind of difficult to do on an individual basis. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about in relation to that is the learning outcomes. And Sandra's going to take that piece.
So Faith has given you a general idea of starting with your learning objectives of your training. I'm going to talk a little more about outcomes and how to start framing the outcomes based on your learning objectives or what you generally want to achieve by conducting or hosting a training. As we mentioned earlier, outcomes equal change. Generally, when we talk about outcomes, we are referring to a change in knowledge, attitude, behavioral intentions, behaviors, or skills. And most of those outcomes should be directly aligned with the length of your training or program. Outcomes can be what you expect the training participants to achieve as a result of participating in their training. So an increase in skill, an increase in competence, an increase in competency. Often sexual misconduct and relationship violence prevention and response training start by increasing awareness about the issues and then go on to focus on the knowledge, attitude, behaviors, behavioral intentions, and skill changes. You can go to the next slide.
So So here's some examples of learning objectives, and I thought this was interesting. This comes from the University of New Hampshire, and this is related to bringing in the bystander program, which many of you may be involved with and have on your campus. But these would be examples of learning objectives. So, for example, to develop skills for both direct and indirect intervention while keeping bystanders' own safety in mind. So direct intervention being, being the primary helper or speak to the person directly, whereas indirect may be seeking assistance from someone else. Secondly, increase knowledge and awareness of the scope and causes of sexual violence or sexual misconduct. So again, we're seeing an objective link to knowledge and awareness about the particular topic. In the first one, we saw a development of skills. Thirdly, increase a sense of responsibility for creating change in one's community related to sexual violence, sexual misconduct, and commit to playing a role in decreasing sexual violence. So we see learning objectives related to an increased sense of responsibility and an overall decrease in sexual violence. And lastly, they're increasing recognition of inappropriate behavior along the continuum of sexual and relationship violence and how to respond to it safely and appropriately. So again, looking at the development of skills and increase in knowledge related to the objectives there. So this was one that I thought folks could relate to, especially if they do have the Bringing in the Bystander program or some sort of bystander intervention initiative, program, training, et cetera. These could be related to what folks are doing on campuses. Next slide.
Yeah. So what we have listed here are some specific outcomes that might relate to the different trainings and programs that you have on your campus. So when we're thinking about taking a learning objective to an outcome, we really hone in on the measurement or evaluating the success of the learning or training activity. Some of the examples of outcomes include articulating 1 to 2 reasons why it is important for all members of the community to be included in sexual assault education and respond. Perhaps another one might be articulating 1 to 2 interesting findings regarding faculty perceptions and understandings of the policies, procedures, and related information to other information related to sexual assault that may be in your training. And a third one might be state 1 new way in which student affairs can provide support to faculty in relation to the sexual misconduct or sexual assault information that you've shared. And that citation comes from the University of Indiana from their NASPA 2016 slides.
So as Carrie mentioned in the introduction, campuses are going to be tasked with not just utilizing the campus climate survey data, but looking at other areas to collect data. And so we thought we'd provide you with some examples of what these might be and some of the things that I've been involved in and Sandra's been involved in as well. So again, looking at ways to collect data and to assess programs, events, trainings, et cetera. So campus events could include something like a walk in her shoes, national domestic violence awareness events, national sexual assault awareness events, white ribbon campaigns, other social media campaigns related to raising awareness and knowledge about sexual misconduct and relationship violence, prevention, and intervention. And some of the things that we utilize here at BGSU to collect data, one being our peer educators and our peer education presentation. And I know many campuses across Ohio have peer eds and do a lot to provide education to their students with those types of programs. So that is an area in which you can collect data and assess the information that those peer educators are providing, and therefore what the students are, what the learning outcomes for the students are related to those presentations. The next bullet there is something that we do in conjunction with our Office of the Dean of Students. So we have, the Office of the Dean of Students could sanction individuals to attend our peer education presentations related to consent or healthy relationships, those types of things. And again, we can utilize those presentations to collect data as far as, what are the learning outcomes based within those presentations. Of course, bystander intervention is something that many, if not all, campuses are engaged in. So whether it's a presentation by peer ed, it's an event related to bystander intervention, it's a training related to bystander intervention. These are all ways in which we can assess, our learning outcomes for the students who are participating, whether it be students, faculty, or staff participating in these different types of programs. National, state, local speakers, for example, there's a picture on that slide of Russ Funk, Be a Stand-Up Guy. He actually came to our campus in the spring to talk about male engagement around the issue of sexual violence. So again, utilizing a speaker, workshop types of events to collect data as far as, what are the participants learning. We also have Mike Domish, who does the Can I Kiss You presentation, come during our opening weekend orientation for our students. And so again, that's another event in which we can collect data relative to that presentation. I mentioned a variety of different campus events as well. And so it's just really thinking about what are things that your campus is doing around prevention, education, training on sexual violence, and what makes the most sense to collect data and look at those learning outcomes relative to those programs, events, trainings.
And then, Faith, I wanted to mention also, going back to that previous slide, I have the BAR training there. And I also work with the rape prevention education folks at the Ohio Department of Health. And one of the things that some of our grantees are doing, and some of those grantees might be in your local communities, some of our grantees are working with the bars, because we know students go to bars if there are bars nearby. Hopefully they're 21 and over, but the students are going to bars. And so what we've started doing with some of the grantees that we're working with is doing some bar training with the folks at the bars. And then we assess the information, not just at the bars, but then with the safety types of procedures that the bars are taking to ensure, one, no underage drinking, and two, making sure that there is some bystander intervention techniques being used at those bars that are near campuses to make sure everybody gets home safely. Now, Faith offered some specific types of training Bowling Green and maybe some of you offer on your campuses to promote sexual misconduct prevention and response. When you start moving towards outcomes and outcome measurement specifically, I always use the acronym SMART to guide me in developing my outcome statement. And when I work with other grantees and folks across programs across the state and across the country, I also use the acronym SMART. So basically what SMART means is that outcomes should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So you want to make sure that whatever outcomes you're measuring, that they align with whatever trainings or programs you're doing on campus. You want to make sure that whatever your anticipated achievement or your percentage of people who change their knowledge, attitude, behaviors, behavioral intentions, or skills align with whatever that dosage is of that training that you're doing. So some of the things that I always talk about is making sure that your outcomes are written in a SMART format. So I give two examples here of a SMART format that I would use if I was looking at a bystander training for the first one. That by the end of the bystander intervention training, at least 85% of those participating will be able to articulate at least one way that they can safely intervene in a potential sexual misconduct situation. So, for example, if you're doing a bystander intervention training and you use a project that has the 4 Ds, it's direct, delay, disrupt, and what's the fourth one, Faith? There's 4 of them. Direct, delay, disrupt. But anyway, the participants would know at least one way that they can safely intervene. And then the second one is, by the end of the training, at least 95% of the resident advisors will understand their role as a mandatory reporter of sexual misconduct. Of course, we would hope that 100%, if you're training your resident advisors in mandatory reporter roles, that all of them would know, but 95% is a reasonable outcome when you're looking at a training that has a lot of different pieces and components in it, and one of those components is mandatory reporting.
Sandra, let me just get the 4 Ds there for you. Direct, distract, delegate, and delay.
Yeah, and delay is usually the one that a lot of people feel more comfortable with, because when you're delaying, basically what you're doing is you're either waiting to talk to the potential perpetrator or you're waiting to offer support to the victim. So if you see something that's happening and you don't feel comfortable being direct and you don't feel there's no one else in the room that you can kind of bring in, then sometimes what folks will feel comfortable doing is delaying that response and offering support or talking to whomever the person is that might be potentially perpetrating that misconduct after the fact. So now that we've talked about some of the types of training that may be happening on your campus, we want to talk a little bit more about who you may partner with to get data for your outcome assessment. Since there may be several initiatives going on your campus, you'll want to do a scan to determine where on campus the trainings are occurring, because you might not be the person directly responsible for providing this training, but it might be an opportunity for you to help report, because you're going to be the person probably responsible for reporting it. So there are probably events going on campus that you could organize around to get your data. So think about who you want to engage in the activities and how you can partner with people on campus who are in need of the information or the trainings. Where are these built-in populations involved in prevention and response work? Some suggestions may include athletics, residence life, orientation leaders, student leaders, public opinion leaders on campus, Greek life students, and then other campus organizations. These groups may be a match for your prevention and response trainings, as well as your campus community at large. So when you're doing your campus climate survey, basically what you're doing is you're doing a survey of your entire campus. But when you want to look at some of these specific trainings, you want to really hone in on specific groups where you can get that data, and groups where things may be going on campus already around sexual misconduct and response. And now that we have some ideas on who we might work with, let's think about how to collect the assessment data. Well, as you can see, there are many different ways, and you probably already know, there are many different mechanisms for collecting assessment data from training participants, including surveys, using handheld devices, using clickables. Some of you may be doing some CAN training on your campuses, such as some online assessment, where you can just download the results at the end of the assessment. I remember when I took the IRB training at Ohio State, at the end I had to take a test, of course, and that assessment said how many, if I passed it 85%, 95%, whatever it was, and that downloaded directly to to whomever on campus needed to keep track of that data. So those canned packages that are out there, they come online, they have assessments already built into them. That's one tool that you can use to report. You can also use Poll Everywhere with your training participants. You can conduct content analysis documents or assessments that include both qualitative and open-ended responses. You can also do an activity-based assessment when you have events and speakers on campus. As you can see in this slide, the Bowling Green had an It's On Us campaign going on their campus, and so you have the students who are holding up their shirts, and hopefully some of those students, I'm sure all of them, and Faith can verify this, probably signed some kind of commitment to It's On Us on their campus. So that's another way that you can collect data for your outcome assessment that you're going to be reporting to ODHE. When you're deciding on the outcomes you will report on, think about the various trainings you're doing on campus and how to best or most efficiently collect assessment data. The methods you use will depend on the training type and your resources, including the time and tools you have to support those efforts.
So there's a variety of things that we really need to consider when we're thinking about who we're going to survey, what types of methods we're going to use. And so the logistics of assessment is an important point to think about. So those logistics could include, what are the capabilities in the room or area in which this event or program or training is going to take place? Do you have access to AV? Those types of things that could really, work to dictate what type of method would be most appropriate to use with that population. Other things, the amount of time that you have to do an assessment of the participants. So is it something that you can do a pre and post test with? Is it something that you'd be able to send out a link and have folks complete? Is it something you want to collect data right then and there? Maybe it's more of a qualitative data collection type of thing. So there's a lot of things that we want to think about when we're thinking about what types of methods that we'll use to assess. Another thing to consider is if you're thinking about using Poll Everywhere or folks utilizing their phones, does everyone have access to a phone? Nowadays, most people do, but there could be certain participants that they wouldn't have that capability. So, looking at all of those things from a logistical standpoint is important when you're considering what type of assessment you're going to do with your particular population. Collaborative opportunities, so there's we're certainly not in this alone. Many of us work with other folks on campus and in the community. And so what are the collaborative opportunities that you have for assessment, whether that's opportunities working with other departments across campus, whether it's working with community folks, whether it's working with academics, institutional research. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that we're working as student affairs, working with academic affairs to align our learning outcomes. And so maybe that's happening on your campuses. Maybe that's something that folks can look into because those are some opportunities to, one, gain some more knowledge and training along assessment, but also create those collaborations. And think about other collaborative events that you have. For example, Sexual Assault Awareness Month activities, programming. Are you collaborating with your local rape crisis center to do activities? One of the pictures there is of our 5K and dog walk that we do in partnership with the Cocoon, which is our local rape crisis center. And so we're assessing that event. We also have the BGSU Care Coalition, which specifically looks at sexual violence as one of their topics, and that is a coalition between campus and community partners. And so again, opportunities for collaboration and assessment within that coalition. thinking about data points from the climate survey. I mean, although Carrie mentioned that can't be our sole source of assessment and data, we may want to use specific questions from the climate survey when we're doing these events, programs, to look and see if there's any changes, between the times that we're conducting those climate surveys or benchmarking questions. And so we may want to do some assessment kind of in between those times and just utilize some of the questions that are within those surveys. Also, taking a look at your institutional culture. What does assessment look like on your campus? Some campuses do a lot of assessment, and it really is a part of their culture. The institutional research folks, faculty, it's just part of what campuses do. And so if folks are a part of a campus like that, there's a lot of resources there. And if you're new to assessment or want to find out more, there's probably a lot of opportunity to do so on a campus that has embraced an assessment culture. But if there's little assessment, then I think it's reaching out to others, other colleagues that have more experience with doing assessment, and looking for webinars like this or other opportunities to increase your knowledge, skills associated with assessment. I think the other thing we need to think about is how assessment works on your campus. One of the things that I know our campus is concerned about is survey fatigue with our students, and not only our students, but our faculty and staff, because a lot of our campus is being asked to conduct a lot of surveys. And so we actually have our institutional research folks looking at, when surveys go out, trying to make sure that we can try to avoid some of that survey fatigue that we know has been happening in the past. So those are just some things to consider. I'm sure there's more, and Sandra, you may have more to add to this list as well. But I think, assessment should always come, as you're beginning to plan your trainings or programs or events, should always be a part of the planning process as far as how you're going to assess what you're doing. And so I think those are some things to consider as we take a look at assessment. Sandra, anything else to add to that list?
Yeah, I would say absolutely start your assessment planning when you're doing your programmatic planning or your training planning. Integrating assessment into your training from the start is going to make it a lot easier for you when you're getting to the point where you need to do data collection and especially data reporting. And I also wanted to mention, since I was pretty involved in the campus climate surveys that were conducted last year, if you use the ODHD questionnaires, there are some bystander questions that you could potentially use for your baseline data from which to build on some programmatics for this year and hopefully to determine some change on your campus as an extra way of looking at assessment from a pre to post test kind of perspective. But I would definitely say there is a lot of survey fatigue out there. I did some focus conversations with some students on one of the campuses, and they were like, we're continuously getting surveyed. And they also mentioned that if you want to engage with them, Facebook is for grandma, so they don't do Facebook. What they do is they use Twitter and Instagram and other social media, Snapchat, and if there's social medias that you use on campus that the students interact with often, if you want to assess student results, then I would definitely use some of those other types of forms of social media to engage those students. So in summary, we wanted to offer you some ideas on how to fulfill your outcome requirements for the Changing Campus Culture Report. You can always open up the chat after we finish and ask Carrie specific questions about the specifics of the reporting, because she's going to hold the answers that Faith and I don't have regarding the reporting specifics. But if we were successful, at least 95% of you should be able to list at least 2 potential sources of assessment data other than the Campus Climate Survey benchmark data, and 2 potential methods on your campus to collect data on prevention or response training. And I'd just like to say thank you for your participation today and for being on this webinar. We know that you have a lot of things to do, and we hope that we have been helpful in helping you get to outcomes.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Faith. Definitely, if you have any questions for Sandra or Faith on any of the materials they covered today, or any additional questions you might have for them or for myself, you can always pull up that chat screen and send a message, and I'll be happy to share the question and then direct it to whomever is best to answer it. So why don't we give a couple minutes for folks who might have questions they want to pose to do so now. So I'm not seeing any questions come through, which is fine. I've also put up both Sandra and Faith's contact information up on the screen for you, should you want to contact them directly or more one-on-one. Oops, wait, I do see a question. Hold on. Please tell us what a learning outcome report looks like. What are your expectations for categorizing the raw language that comes from assessing learning outcomes? I'm assuming that's directed towards our presenters. Faith or Sandra, either of you want to take that on?
Carrie, can you repeat that?
Yep. Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Let me rephrase. Okay, trying to read from afar. My computer's not set up great here. Okay, please tell us what a learning outcome report looks like. What are your expectations for categorizing the raw language that comes from assessing learning outcomes? Sorry, I don't have my glasses on.
I'm wondering if that's directly related to what your reporting template looks like, Carrie, because are you changing it from last year, or will it be the same template?
The annual report template, if the question is directed for the annual report template, last year just simply asked if you were completing an assessment or not for your prevention and response trainings. So obviously that question will still exist, and then Skip Logic will be built in that if you answer yes, some more detailed information would be asked in terms of, you know, which trainings, you know, you did assess or you assessed and that sort of thing. It's not going to get ridiculously in depth. But I'll send that report out to you all towards the end of the spring semester. But I believe, based on the response back, they were looking for you or Faith to respond to it. But I did answer the other question as best I could at this point.
Yeah, when we do our learning outcomes, so we're taking each individual learning outcome and assessing that. And so, for example, the assessment may be a percentage, and so we could say, you know, 85% of participants met this learning outcome, or whatever it may be. And so we're able to summarize that with our data. And so we collect our raw data, but oftentimes in our learning outcome reports, we summarize that, whether that be in charts or graphs or various types of things. So we're assessing each learning outcome and whether or not we met those particular outcomes.
Yes, and that's generally what I do as well. So you may have so many responses based on whatever the items are that you're asking. Say you have 5 items, and then what you do is you look at the difference from pre to post, and then from there you summarize what that looks like, and then you report that percentage. So I think that probably and Carrie, are you asking for 2 different trainings to be assessed?
Well, I have not set that yet, Sandra.
Okay, because I thought somewhere I saw 2. But anyway, I would just report on whatever that summary data is, and whatever that percentage that met whichever criteria you're going to use for that training.
In general, for everybody, what we're looking for is that you conduct these assessments. We ask during recommendation 2 that you do a prevention training and you do a response training. So I guess technically, there would be 2, because we want to make sure that you're assessing both your work in prevention as well as response. And so I guess, yes, there would be 2. Again, I don't want anybody to get overly worked up or concerned. It's not going to be an entirely additional report that has to be generated. Again, because it's public record once it comes to me, so I'm not looking for your results and all that sort of stuff. But more that the intent of what I'm asking for assessment to have been completed was done, and that you're not just relying on climate survey data to gauge your assessment and the effectiveness of your programs and whatnot. So again, I'll get that information to you, but it's not. Please don't get worried about it or concerned about it, or any of those things at this point. It's not on that level. Utilizing a lot of the stuff that Sandra and Faith shared with you today, any of those components and whatnot will be more than sufficient for what I would be asking.
Yeah, so if you're using a bystander intervention training as your prevention training, then what you would do is you would summarize your results and say, whatever percentage of those participants met the criteria that you're using for learning, for your learning outcome. And then if you're doing something around response, then you could ask some folks around where maybe they would send a friend or an acquaintance about resources on or off campus. You could use something of that nature. So what percentage said they would send them to the local domestic violence or rape crisis center, or support from a campus support system. So those could be potential outcomes.
There was an additional question. Can you identify the questions from the benchmark survey that address bystander intervention? The benchmark questions do not address bystander intervention. They ask if you did a training in prevention, or ask your students if they attended a training in prevention, and whether or not it was effective or how effective they gauge it to be. But that is not. But there is no in-depth questions in the benchmark questions to evaluate bystander intervention. So I think that would be something that you would be looking for through your climate survey, and not through the ODHE benchmark questions. Any other questions? I didn't see any more enter the chat room as we were discussing the others. Well, again, you all have Faith and Sandra's contact information up on your screen, as well as you all have mine. So if you have any additional questions that come to you down the road, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with those questions. We'll be happy to answer them. Thank you all for joining today. And just a reminder that there are 2 other webinars I sent you an email about yesterday coming up in November, one on November 15th, reviewing the recent action by the Office of Civil Rights, and some things that campuses throughout Ohio should be considering or are considering at this point. And then November 20th, reviewing climate surveys and that process moving forward. So thank you all, and have a good afternoon. Happy Halloween.